Everyone, welcome to the April 8th work session of the Ann Arbor City Council with respect to transportation in the fiscal year 2021 and groundwater issues. First up, transportation. Mr. Lazarus, you have the con.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to turn the controls over to Mr. Yuppie and crew.
Before you go on, if we could have signs at below shoulder level so that folks behind you can see, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
So this is Mr. Hutchinson, our very distinguished city engineer.
And I'm going to be sharing my presentation here with Raymond Hess, our transportation manager. I'm going to take the first half and then hand it off to him. So I'm going to start off, we've got kind of a mix of different topics that we're going to cover today related to transportation. And I'm going to start off with an update of what we've got going on this year in the 2019 construction season. This map here was in your packet along with this. And in addition to the map, there's also an actual written list of streets that we're going to be doing work on this year. So I'm not going to go through and read all of those out individually. I don't think that would be very exciting. So, but I do want to hit some highlights of what we've got going on this year. First of all, the blue highlighted streets on the map that you see here, those are our resurfacing and rehabilitation type projects. Those are the slightly longer term projects, maybe 3 weeks, a month or more in duration, and those are the more extensive treatments that we've got going on those streets. And some of the highlights of those are up on the northeast side, we're doing Traverwood up there. We've got a piece of Platt Road down in the southeast that we're working on. Piece of Stone School there between Eisenhower and I-94. Of course, we have the work that we need to finish on Scioto Church that started last year. And then in closer to the downtown, we've got work going on East Hoover, and the DDA is doing work on William Street as well, which you've heard about recently, I think. And then there's a blue mark on State Street there. That's it's shown in blue, although it's really more of a maintenance project, doing some concrete repairs on the concrete overlay on that street. And then finally, looking at some of the local residential streets that we're working on, you'll see a kind of a conglomeration in the Water Hill neighborhood there. That's our focus area this year for the residential street resurfacing. The last few years we've been trying kind of a new technique, not technique, but new strategy for local street resurfacing in targeting a more targeting a tighter area to work in each year, and that helps minimize disruption to the neighborhoods. We're not coming in and out in the same neighborhood all the time, and also gets us a little bit better prices with our contractor by keeping the work together instead of spread out all over the city. And then the orange highlighted streets, those are our capital preventative maintenance type projects. You might remember from some previous presentations that these are the short-term work. These are the things that we do to try to maintain the pavement in a good condition. So a lot of these streets, you might hear from constituents, saying, why are we resurfacing this street? It's not as bad as that street. And the purpose behind that is, again, we're trying to maintain and do preventative maintenance on our roads instead of just letting them get to the point of failure. So not shown on this map is also some of the crack sealing that we'll be doing. That's kind of the bottom level of the preventative maintenance. We didn't put it on the map just because it would make the map a little bit too busy, but those are very short term, in and out in usually a day or two. So I wanted to include a slide here on pavement markings, because I know this time of year we're often hearing a lot of complaints about pavement markings. And right now we're just wrapping up our seasonal evaluation of the pavement markings around the city. And the reason we do that seasonally is because oftentimes our pavement markings on our street don't hold up very well to the snowplows over the winter. So this time of year is the ideal time to get in and do an evaluation of those and get our work set for this coming year. So I don't have a full list of where all that's going to be happening, but just to give you some idea, on the left there, I show what all of our budgets are, for at least for the next couple of fiscal years. And those are pretty consistent from year to year. But those amounts from our major and local street fund and the alt fund translate into about 37 miles of long line remarking. And long lines are just what they sound like. A long line is like the center line striping or the edge markings, literally the long lines on the street. And roughly 14 miles of bike lane remarking as well. And then about 375 intersections remarked. That's our kind of estimate for what we'll be doing this summer. I wanted to talk briefly at a kind of a high level here about projections for road funding and where those stand. This chart that you see here is showing our major and local street funds, the local in orange and the major in green. These are our Act 51 or the state weight and gas tax revenues that we get. And the main story here is you can see the uptick in the more recent years on this graph. And that reflects the state's commitment, promise, however you want to put it, to increased road funding to municipalities in Michigan. So you can see the last 3 years are estimated revenues, and as long as they continue with the funding levels that we're expecting, then that's what we're expecting to see. Now, where are we planning to spend those increased funds from Act 51? A few examples of where that would be spent is first of all, our Public Works Department is planning to do some contracting for some spray patching for potholes. That's a relatively new technique for patching potholes that we have very high hopes for giving a higher quality product in our pothole patching. One of the key points is the second one on here, is that's that increased capital maintenance. Those are your orange streets on the map that we showed before. A lot of times or in most cases, a lot of our Act 51 money goes towards that capital preventative maintenance side of things. And then pedestrian safety enhancements is another one. We'll hear more about that in just a little bit when Raymond gets up here. And then also a relatively minor part of it, but also important, is in the administrator's proposed budget, there's one FTE for an additional senior transportation engineer as well. So our other major source of road funding is the street, bridge, and sidewalk millage. And just as an example, FY20 anticipated revenue is approximately $12.9 million. And you can see that just about 75% of that, as it's anticipated, this is the pie chart, is the anticipated spending for that fiscal year, is going towards street work, either resurfacing or capital preventative maintenance. And then another sliver towards sidewalk repair, which probably puts us around 80%. The other two, the blue pieces of pie, are money from this fund being spent on crosswalks and pedestrian safety activities. And then the other sliver of other, I believe that includes bridges, retaining walls associated with roads, and some various other miscellaneous things. So now I want to go into giving you some updates on some specific transportation projects or some specific transportation-related efforts that we have going on, some of the more high-profile things that you may have heard of. First of all, I wanted to update you on the Allen Creek berm opening project, and I'm going to skip ahead a couple of slides and then come back to this one, actually. For those of you that haven't seen this before, or maybe you're not as familiar with this project, this is a plan view layout of the Allen Creek berm opening project. And this is a pretty unique project and a very exciting project that does a couple of seemingly unrelated things simultaneously. One, from the stormwater side, it will lower the floodplain in this area by up to 6 feet, which is a very advantageous thing to have happen. And then on the pedestrian side, it creates a connection for pedestrians to get from the main and depot area out to the border-to-border trail. So you can see on the drawing here that the kind of the east-west street is Depot, and North Main would be just off the page to your left. And this creates a legal way for pedestrians to get over to Argo Dam and then to the border-to-border trail. And there's a nice conceptual view of that here, looking at the railroad from the north side. So this would be kind of looking from the DTE parcel there. And you can see where the path comes under the railroad berm and then kind of loops around and back over where Allen's Creek empties out. And then to the right would then connect to the border-to-border trail. So just going back real quickly to this slide. So status update on this project. We celebrating last week that we finally got all the easements signed that we needed for this project. And we've now submitted plans to MDOT for a bid letting. We are anticipating being in the June bid letting. That's a little bit tentative. We were a little bit late for the official deadline for that, so it's kind of in MDOT's hands right now. But assuming that that we do get into the June bid letting for MDOT, construction will commence in July and run through November. That will get us about halfway, or probably a little bit more than halfway through the project, with then work being completed in the spring of 2020. That's probably, the way we've got it slated right now, probably the work on the north half would be in 2020. So. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Raymond Hess to cover the remaining part of the presentation.
Thank you, Nick. Mayor, Council, Raymond Hess, Transportation Manager. So to start off, I wanted to highlight the pedestrian safety improvements. I think this is something that hopefully you all are well aware of. Pursuant to Council Resolution R-18497, we've had a series of different deliverables that we've been reporting to you over the last several months, starting back in January when the crosswalk design guidelines took effect. Then in early February, we reported on the last 3 years of improvements that have been accomplished, as well as the planned improvements for 2019, and an inventory of all the kind of major mid-block crosswalks, for lack of a better term. The next deliverable that'll be coming to you here shortly is the upgrade estimates. Again, that was something that was requested in terms of what it would take to bring all of our sidewalks that aren't meeting the target design into that target design that's been identified. And then the last piece are monthly updates for this construction cycle starting in April as well. And I believe that's going to be communicated as part of the city administrator's report for the mid-April meeting. So you'll be getting that update here shortly as well. I think you've seen the information, but for 2019, I think what's worth mentioning are the 13 crosswalks planned for this 2019. New rectangular rapid flashing beacons at 9 new locations, new gateway treatment, updated pavement markings at 8 locations, bump outs at 14 locations, lighting at 41 new locations, updated signage at 3 locations, pedestrian signal improvements at 2 locations, and schools speed zones at 1 location. So those are some of the things that we expect to accomplish starting pretty much right away. Now the construction frost laws came off today, I believe, so you're going to start seeing some movement happening. All right, I touched on streetlights just a second ago, so we are anticipating 41 streetlight improvements. To date, we have 10 city locations that have been upgraded. We have 4 DTE locations that have been installed, and we have 5 other locations that have been accomplished as part of other projects. So some of that work is, was able to be done over the winter months. So we got a little bit of an early start, but we do expect some of that to ramp up as well. In total, this map, just so you know, this map shows the priorities that have been identified. There are about 199 locations. It's probably over 200 actually now because new locations come into the fold about weekly. And so we always rerun the prioritization model as part of that. The prioritization model has about 10 different criteria that are factored into that equation in terms of where they shake out. And we want to make sure that and whenever we make an improvement to a crosswalk, like I mentioned the RFBs earlier, we want to make sure that there's complementary lighting as part of that as well. And that's direction we've heard from council loud and clear. We want to make sure that we do that. I will say we're trying to coordinate schedules as best possible, because sometimes if it's a DTE light, but we're doing the construction internally, sometimes, there's a little bit of a disconnect there, but we do our best to work with DTE to get those installed at the same time. All right, and then lastly, Ann Arbor Station, we thought it would be helpful to give you an update on where that project is. So the archaeological survey is currently under the State Historic Preservation Officer review. So the initial report that we developed indicates that there are no significant archaeological resources out there, so we expect that report to be approved. The NEPA document is currently with the FRA. We are expecting a response back on that draft by the end of this week. And so, fingers crossed, we'll get a kind of favorable review of that, and we'll be able to kind of move on to the next step. One of those next steps is kind of the preliminary engineering. Many of you may know that we're doing kind of a very basic preliminary engineering to about the 5% level, just to kind of understand the lay of the land and the layout of the project. And so FRA had a comment about kind of the platform location, and we've been in discussion with them about that. And the hope is to have the federal finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI, waka waka waka, by later this summer. So hopefully that'll get us to a point where we can kind of reach the next milestone and figure out where to go next with the project. And I believe that concludes my presentation, and I think Nick and I would be happy to entertain any specific questions you might have.
Thank you. I have a few that I wrote down. I might need to come back, but I just wanted to jump on it. There's going to be a considerable amount of construction in the Waterhill area this summer, so I'm sure me and Chip are going to get some extra emails. What did we learn from the first time we did this? Because there's a new strategy, I heard, and that last one was also in the 5th Ward, I think. Jefferson, 5th Street, 5th Street, of course, 4th. What were some of the takeaways from that? Another thing was on the berm, you said lowering the floodplain or the flood by, maps by 6 feet. How does that affect city-owned properties in the area? It's 712, or if there's any in that area. So just a couple quick ones I'm throwing out right now.
To address your first one, this strategy that we've done for local resurfacing, have at least a couple of years of that under our belt now. It was 2 years ago that we did the Old West Side area there. Last year we were over in the 2nd Ward off of Green and Glacier in that area. And I think it's worked pretty well. I think the biggest takeaway to learn from is we need to communicate a lot with the residents, let them know where we are at any given time, because we're not working on every street in the neighborhood at the same time. We do kind of bits and pieces and move through it so that residents have places to park while we're on their street and things like that. And I think it's mostly a communication thing that makes it work pretty well. I think it worked pretty well last year, and I think this neighborhood is somewhat similar to that neighborhood. Is a little closer to the downtown, certainly, but yeah, I think that's the main thing, is communication and keeping our contractor focused on getting one. He'll be on a few streets at a time, but we can never really. They would love to go and open up everything all at once, and then wait till the end and then pave it all. But we've got lots of things in the contract to prevent that kind of thing from happening, and we'll constantly be monitoring them. Our inspectors will be out on the site as well to help people if they're confused, if they're not sure where they can go or how to get back to their house and things like that. We've got people around that can help as well. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was hoping you'd say that, and if we could just have increased communication.
Yep.
Go a long way.
Yeah. The Old West Side neighborhood, I think, was the first neighborhood that we did that on, so we definitely were some things that we learned from that.
Yeah, it seems to be a good idea. I mean, it's nice when the whole area is done and it's not just
Yeah.
sections and you smooth one, for a few and then it's
Right.
rubble. It's nice when the whole area is taken care of. Just as the representative of the Fifth Ward, I'm going to ask for a little pork belly here. The roads, I saw in orange, Scioto Church west of 7th and Liberty east of coming into downtown weren't slated for anything, and they're in pretty bad shape right now. And and Washington is is horrible as well. But when do we have any idea when some of these other roads, especially as cyclists, I find it, and I know this is not staff's, but I just like to put it on record. It's very dangerous for cyclists, especially in that stretch of Liberty, east of Crest, coming into 7th, and obviously on Scioto Church, same thing. And so anyhow, when we discuss these things, and we talk about pedestrian safety and safety for cyclists, it reminds me that these roads need attention for more than just cars. So just a little bit there, and then we could talk about the lowering of the floodplain. But if you can finish answering that, thanks. Sorry,
Sure.
it took so long.
Address a couple of the ones that you brought up there. The west end of Scioto Church is actually in our capital improvement plan. It's, I think for 2021, it's a federal aid project. It'll be a pretty substantial project, so that is coming up soon. The piece of Liberty that you see on here, we stopped where we stopped because there's a water main project that needs to happen to the east of that, and I don't recall what year that's in, but we are planning to go at least in the worst parts of the bike lane and do a little quick resurfacing in the bike lane between Crest and 7th, which I agree are some of the worst parts of our bicycle lane system there. Washington, I know we just put that into the CIP. I don't recall what year that is. Down by the Y in particular, there's some work that needs to happen there, but I don't recall the year for that. In terms of your question about the Allen Creek berm opening project, I do not know the stat that I've heard is that the lowering the floodplain by up to 6 feet, which obviously as you move further out from that deepest spot, it gets lower and lower. I don't know how far that zone goes out, if it reaches all the way to 721 or not, but I can find out that information and get back to you with that.
Councilmember Lum.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Don't go very far, Mr. Hutchinson. Thanks to you and everyone here, all staff, for conducting these work sessions. They're very informative and helpful for council as we go through the annual budget process, and obviously they're informative for the public as well. So thanks for pulling together all this information and for the prompt responses to the budget questions. It's all very helpful. So I've got a bunch of questions, and I'll send in some after tonight, things that aren't covered tonight. So just some questions about fixing the roads. So now we've talked a couple of times about the challenges in actually spending the money that we have for fixing the roads, and the challenges with finding contractors and managing the workload internally. So I'm wondering if you can please speak to what we're doing to overcome those challenges, those obstacles for the upcoming construction season. And I keep asking about this because it's been a bit frustrating to me and the residents that we haven't been able to find a way to spend the money that we actually have to fix the roads. So what are we doing to address this?
Well, first thing I would say, I believe for this year, at least since that's what's in front of me right now, I think we're doing a pretty good job of spending everything we have. And as a matter of fact, we're monitoring very closely to make sure that we're not going over what we have. In terms of the challenges that we face, regarding contractor capacity and things like that, I think we're in okay shape right now in terms of roads. We don't get our bids in for our annual resurfacing program until this Friday. So I'll know more after that, certainly, to see what kind of prices we're getting on that. One thing I can say is last year, we actually, we typically only have 2 or 3 bidders on that program. It's usually bid by the large asphalt companies, and one a few years ago bought out another, so that kind of decreased the competition. Exactly. So prices tend to go up when that happens. Last year, one thing that I think was a positive thing is one of the companies that is not typically the low bidder on our projects got the project. So I think that will help keep kind of the regular contractor honest in terms of bids. So I'm hoping that that'll help a little bit of good competition. I mean, the biggest problem with that is that there's all of our asphalt comes from basically 1 or 2 places locally, and that is controlled by Cadillac Asphalt in the area. So it's not the kind of work that you can truck in crews and material. You can truck in crews from a longer distance away, but it's really difficult to truck in asphalt from a long distance away. It has to be manufactured at a certain temperature, and it needs to have that temperature maintained until it gets to the site. So the local plants almost always win out in that respect. So that's a challenge, but the fact that we do have another contractor that's close enough to be competitive is helpful. In the end of the capital preventative maintenance, we're getting pretty decent prices from the contractor that's doing that work. So I think we're in good shape there. We've talked to them about, we have a lot of capital preventative maintenance work that we're doing this year, and we talked to them about extending their contract. The contract was set up to be a multi-year contract, and they seem to have the capacity to do that. So I'm hoping the contractors are finding more employees and can get more crews running and things like that to help with the capacity issue.
Okay, sounds good. And in that, thank you, in that same spirit, I want to make sure that the fiscal year 20 expenditure budget includes all the available funding for fixing the roads. And you'll recall from last year that there was excess fund balance in the major and local street funds that council passed a budget amendment to spend. So a couple questions related to that. Are we going to spend all of the money budgeted for this fiscal year 19 for road repair? And second, does the budget you're proposing include any excess fund balance in the major and local street funds as it did a year ago?
So I might not be the best person to ask that, so I might have to ask you to send that question to us later.
Got it.
The fund that I monitor is the Street Bridge and Sidewalk Millage.
Okay.
And for that, I can tell you that we are spending to the extent that we can, so that we maintain the recommended fund balance, and are trying to maintain that. So we're not planning to build the fund balance. We want to spend as much of it as we possibly can. And I'll have to defer the question about the Act 51.
Okay, I'll send that in. Just a couple
Okay.
more. So also on street repair funding, so Governor Whitmer's proposed a road funding plan that's paid for with a higher gas tax. And do we have any sense of what that plan would mean for Ann Arbor?
At this time, no, we haven't seen exactly how it's going to break down between state and local and county. But when we get it, when it's more detail, we'll share it.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Krupe. Slide 8, can you, and I can follow on this one too, I was wondering if you could provide a bit of detail on what's in the 876,000 other? Is that the transportation engineer FTE?
No, that's funded through Act 51. I don't have the detailed breakdown of what's
Okay.
in the other slide right now, but if you submit that, we can
Okay, I'll submit that too.
mine
And
that
then-
data for you.
Okay, I'll submit. And then the last item on streets, slide 8, again, which shows the detail on how the fiscal year 20 street millage dollars are going to be spent. Again, helpful and informative. So, not tonight, I'm sure, but if you could provide a similar slide or spreadsheet that shows the detailed spending for the major and local street funds in fiscal year '20, that would be great.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Councilmember Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Hutchinson, Mr. Hupy, and Mr. Hess. Just a few clarifying questions. On slide 4, the approximate budgets for pavement markings, are those cumulative numbers for fiscal year 2021 or per year?
Those are, that's a good question. I believe those are per year.
Okay. Thank you. And then slide 8, comparing back to 6, the dollars look to be about $500,000 off in terms of projections for this year, and then the dollar stated. Are these supposed to be different numbers?
So are you comparing slide 8 to slide 6?
Correct.
Slide 6 is our Act 51.
Got it. So it's
And
state
slide
funding
8 is
versus
our
local.
street millage.
So that'd be state versus local. They just happen to be very
Yeah.
similar numbers.
Yeah. They
Got
do.
That's very helpful. And then on the same slide 8, similar to Councilmember Lum's question, could we also get some detailed information around crosswalk installation? So for any new crosswalks being constructed, where those will be located?
Yeah, we can work on that. That's something that's still very much in development.
Got it.
And is, it's a actively changing thing, so.
Okay, no, fair enough.
But yeah, we can put together the, the best list we've got right now.
Okay, and I'm sure it's, no comparison to Ward 2, but Ward 3 certainly has a good amount of neighborhood without sidewalk, and being able to provide input earlier in that process would be preferred than seeing a finalized list later.
Sure.
Thanks.
Councilmember Eaton.
Oh, I'm sorry, actually,
sorry, my
one last question. With respect to the berm opening and its relation to the DTE property, Planning Commission reviewed and recommended approval for the DTE redevelopment this past week, and it will be a topic of conversation in the coming months at this table. As part of the conversation around the rezoning to PUD, was some initial conversations about what would and what could and could not be included in a brownfield. I saw the pedestrian bridge included in that potential conversation, and I just wanted to get a sense of, well, first of all, is that the right pedestrian bridge that I'm referring to? And second, if it is, as we're thinking through kind of our public projects in this area, when will we start to get a sense of what is included in their brownfield? What is the brownfield timeline there, just so we can make sure we understand what pot of money different assets will be coming from?
That would be a discussion with community services.
Do you have a sense of timeline?
The discussion of what's included as eligible under brownfield TIF is still fluid.
Okay. And so as we look at renderings like this one, should we take it with a grain of salt that pedestrian bridge
That
will be
pedestrian
funded?
bridge will happen. It is being bid.
Okay.
My understanding is the pedestrian bridge that's in the brownfield is a bridge across the river.
So it's a different pedestrian bridge? Got it,
Yeah,
okay.
That way, what that does, just the thought now is by having additional parking on the DTE property, we can relieve some of the parking issues in the Argo neighborhood. People can park and then walk across the bridge.
So these could be multiple pedestrian bridges. This one's included in a City of Ann Arbor project, but there could be an additional one that connects the city park to the DTE property.
Correct.
At a later point. Okay,
That's
very
I do
helpful.
want to give, just while we have a little bit of time, give staff the credit. This was not an easy set of easements to pull together between MDOT, private property owners, and DTE. So they were shrewd negotiators and good at what they did to get this project launched, and using a lot of other people's money, I might add.
I would just add real quick, the pedestrian bridge that you see on here is kind of the pedestrian bridge light, I guess. This is not crossing the river. This is crossing where Allen's Creek discharges through the berm opening.
Okay.
So that we weren't making people walk through an
Yeah.
active creek, we had to build a smaller pedestrian bridge going over that
That
discharge
seems
area.
fair. And it's helpful to understand that there are talks about multiple bridges, which I think is great. So thank you very much for all of your preparation for all this and all the negotiation to get those easements.
Councilmember Reed?
Thank you. And thank you. This is very informative. I appreciate all the work that went into this. Last year's construction season was interrupted by a labor dispute. And as I recall, that labor dispute reached a temporary settlement towards the end of the season. Do we know if they've resolved all of their problems, or are we going to face something like this again?
I really don't know. I have not heard. I heard very little about the original labor dispute before it actually happened, and I've heard very little about the resolution over the, if there has been a resolution over the winter. If I find any, I'll poke around a little bit, and if I find anything out, I'll let you know.
Thank you so much. And then I have a question of Mr. Hess about slide, I believe it's 14. A constituent supplied me with information that was revealed from a FOIA disclosure. Apparently in September of last year, we submitted final cost estimates for the Ann Arbor train station. And if I'm reading this right, Phase 1 is estimated to cost about $88 million. Phase 2, about $83 million, for a total of $171 million. Is there an explanation as to why this, every time we look at it, it seems to have gone up dramatically in price?
Well, I don't, being relatively new to the project and new to the area, I can't really speak to past costs associated with it. I know there was a lot of back and forth with the Federal Railroad Administration in terms of the site. There was a lot of discussion back and forth about the site itself, and then there were a lot of different considerations into the actual kind of attributes of the station that led to a lot of modifications. In terms of where the station was located on the site, the parking associated with the site, where the platform was located. And so I think each one of those kind of iterations has just led to, changes in the cost estimates. So, I think it's just kind of the nature of this project. I know this project has also been talked about, as I understand it, for quite some time. And so every time we kind of revisit costs, the costs, get adjusted based on kind of the more recent information we have related to what estimates are and what the cost of building things are. It is a pretty hefty price tag. Staff acknowledges that. And I think, there's going to be a conversation that needs to be had about, what the next step is once the NEPA process is done.
Okay.
I think the best answer, though, council members, let's get you a more formal response to your question and lay out where we understand we are right now with cost and phasing.
And if that could give us some insight as to why every time we look at this, it's $10 million more expensive than the previous time, that would help me
Some of the
understand.
long-term, as I understand, some of the long-term costs also deal with some plan in the future for double tracking, and that requires some additional changes beyond what we might have originally thought. So I think, in fairness to all, the best thing is to lay out how the site and how the plan is developed and what the costs are, and that'll answer your question.
Yeah,
And I
definitely do
appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I also heard you say during the presentation that we're moving forward on our preliminary engineering as well.
Yeah, that was part of, as I understand it, the Federal Railroad Administration grant that we got to do this work, that it was the NEPA plus kind of the very beginning of that process as well. So it's not full-blown engineering.
It's about a 5%
Right.
design. Normally, they require more, but as this project developed and FRA had us look at multiple sites, the amount of detailed design that was done at any particular option was less than a 20, 30% design. So it's really not a very in-depth design. It's enough to support the EA, and then also there are some local actions that need to be taken before we do anything, and it provides enough design, I think, to support that. But it's not a detailed design with signals and switching and tracking and all that. It's really,
But it's money that we've already allocated.
yes.
Okay. And then one final question, not of you, but of the city administrator. When staff submitted to the FRA various estimates for the multiple sites. As I recall, a cost assigned to maintaining the current site with improved parking on the DTE property was that we would have to add a traffic lane in each direction on Broadway Bridge. But more recently, the DTE developer, Roxbury, has submitted a traffic plan for a considerably more active use of that property that doesn't include that. Have we reconciled their traffic study with the one that we based our cost estimates for the depot site?
I think the best thing is to, let me go back and talk to staff and then give you an answer to that question. I know both traffic studies were considered, but I don't know that. Rather than guess, I'd rather have the opportunity to give you a better answer.
And if in fact the Roxbury traffic study shows that we don't need those traffic lanes, extra traffic lanes on the bridge, are we then obligated to revise our estimates that we've submitted to the FRA?
Well, I think it's a different demand for different use, and I think that's what has to be reconciled. The daily demand for future train travel is different than the fixed demand for the development of the site, and I think that's what we should provide you with that analysis.
Thank you so much.
Got council members Hayner and Nelson, then perhaps we call it Councilmember Bannister, and then perhaps we call it a day on this. Councilmember Hayner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I had a couple of questions about the engineering, 5% engineering. So the drawings that I saw that had the $170+ million price tag on it, that's not a sufficient, that wasn't a sufficient, rendering or mock-up of the potential station and associated massive parking structures to fit that requirement. We have to do more than that? That's what I understand? I mean, I saw a drawing that was associated with that letter that said that the cost of this, the FRA had told us that the cost of this station was an order of magnitude higher than similar stations in other cities that they'd foot the bill for. And that looked like, I mean, the biggest parking structure I'd ever seen with a tiny train station attached with it.
The construction is phased.
Okay.
The construction, the long-term full build-out includes construction for double tracking at some point in the future, which is not something that we can put a time frame on right now. The reason the level of design is less, if you go back to the very source documents where there was one site to be developed in full, we would have gotten more detailed drawings. But as this process has gone through the extended time frame, FRA asked us to look at additional sites and do some degree of design for each one. So in effect, they modified the original scope of work, which is why we're down to a much lower degree of engineering. We all know there's a hazard in taking an order of magnitude estimate and locking in on that at this stage. So clearly, the cost of the station is a concern of the discussion with FRA, but I do ask to remember that it is phased, and what you're looking at is an ultimate cost of construction for a full build-out at some point in the future, which may or may not occur.
And if it's my understanding that at some point in the future, we still have a ordinance on the books that says that the people get to vote on this, and so at some point, we're gonna, what are we, waiting for another election to call that forward, or what the mechanism is, but at some point, we should put this to the people.
As a point of information, there is no ordinance on the books to that. That was a
The resolution, rather.
that was a pledge of a prior council.
So the
We just need to.
so in order to get to the point where this can be presented in accordance with that resolution, we need to get through the environmental assessment and have a preliminary design. The preliminary design doesn't commit us to anything long-term, but there is benefit to finishing the environmental assessment and protecting the dollars we spent on getting there.
So my other question is not related to that at all. It's a pedestrian safety and road surfacing question. What category does a project like this fall under? On the corner of Miller and Main, on the west side of Main, the crosswalk is in horrendous shape. Two resurfacings have failed to touch each other. And this happens all the time. There's many of these around the city. I'm sure you're aware of them, especially right, down here, down by the county building where we all go. Does that fall under crosswalk spending, road resurfacing spending, pedestrian safety spending? Where's the money going to come from to fix the horrible condition of these downtown crosswalks? I want to know because I want to dedicate it to it in our budget. They're ankle twisters all over downtown where these road resurfacing projects failed to come fully together, it appears to me.
Yeah, that is, the situation you describe is something that in the past has, maybe we haven't done quite the level of planning that we needed to in the past in order to make sure that, some of that matches up. Now, at Miller and Main, for example, I'm not exactly sure what would have happened there if it was the MDOT's Main Street resurfacing.
Yeah, I wondered if it was
Yeah.
a failure to
Yeah.
coordinate with MDOT.
Yeah, that was, yeah, and so what we've done most recently, a couple of years ago, we actually had our own public works crews go around and do some resurfacing of crosswalks themselves. Being that, there's kind of a different level of care that needs to be put towards the crosswalk, that's beyond what is required for a vehicle, for example. And I don't know if we have any more of those slated right now, but that's certainly something that we can look into, particularly in downtown where we have the highest pedestrian volumes.
Okay.
So it's, it should be, and I believe we are doing a little bit better job of this now into looking at the limits that we do in a project and making sure that we're extending the limits through an intersection that maybe hadn't been touched yet. One example that I can think of that I know we were talking about just recently is on Stone School Road, one of the roads that we're doing this year, that previous resurfacings have gone up to the Eisenhower intersection but not gone through it, so we're making sure that this project goes into the intersection and picks all of that up, so.
All right, thank you. That's it, we want to get going.
My question is for Mr. Hess. I'm not sure what you were talking about when you listed the pedestrian improvements, so I'm curious for clarification. If you were talking about mid-block improvements, I heard you say that you had plans for 14 bump outs and lighting improvements at 2 locations. Are those strictly mid-block crosswalks, or?
Yeah, so the improvements that I identified were the ones that we reported back in February for the ones that we were suggesting for 2019. I can probably pull those up if you have specific questions on like which ones are the bump outs, which ones are those.
Yeah, I was just curious how many of the bump outs were at intersections, because I'm remembering meetings that were happening around Scioto Church and 7th, and I was just curious how many, if we were going to recreate that intersection in other at other intersections.
Well, no, I don't think the improvements that were done at 7th and Scioto, whether that's similar.
Well, I mean, that's a bump out,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
I guess when you said
Right.
14 bump outs, I was just curious if we were replicating that kind of a design at other intersections.
Well, most of the time our bump outs tend to be, I think the situation at that intersection is a little bit different because it was trying to channelize traffic a little bit differently. And, we had that public meeting last month to get citizen feedback, and we're currently working on, what the redesign of that will be. So I think the scale of that is a little bit different than what we would be looking at for other bump outs. So most other bump outs tend to be, if it's a mid-block, for example, you have them like on Pauline as you're approaching Almendinger Park, that help bring the pedestrian a little bit further out in the field of vision for motorists. So they're still in a protected curb space, but they're not further back off the sidewalk. So I think the majority of the crosswalks that we do and bump outs that we do associated with those crosswalks are similar like that in nature.
Well, so since there are only 2 of them, I'm curious, what were the 2 locations that you identified as most in need of lighting as an immediate concern?
Lighting or?
Well, so maybe I misheard you. So I heard 14 bump outs and 2 locations that were designated for lighting improvements. I was surprised that there weren't more for lighting improvements. Maybe I misheard.
No, there are 40 locations for lighting
Oh,
improvements.
40. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know where I got 2.
So I can,
Okay. All right. Oh, okay. Never mind. I guess maybe I submitted as a question. I'm curious. I would be curious to know where those 14 bump outs are, actually.
sure. I'll tell you what, we'll follow up with that.
Thank you.
Yeah. But it is in the February material as well, and I think there's even a poster board back there that has all the locations, but we'll follow up with you as well.
I have truncated my questions so that Councilmember Griswold might get in some of her good questions, if possible. I just wanted to, from a resident standpoint, trying to figure out how to follow along with us. So if we add slides 4, 6, and 8 together, those were the separate ones that they had total up to, we're going to be spending at 26.7 million, it looks like. And so one of my questions was, as I reflect on the Northside Seams Safe Routes to School $1 million project, I was wondering, of the 26.7 million, do we get a percentage of grants on those?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you?
Well, I know on the $1 million Safe Routes to School project, 400,000 was grants. So as we add up your slide 4, 6, and 8, and we come up with almost 27 million, is that leveraged with grants also?
So the numbers that you see in there, and I'm not sure that adding all those together is going to give you the right number, because I think some of it is double counted, like the pavement markings is already covered in the general Act 51 slide. But if I understand your question correctly, grant funding is not shown in these. These are our revenues that would come from Act 51 specifically and from the millage specifically. Grant funds are separate from this. We use these funds to leverage those grant funds. Almost all grants have some kind of requirement for a local match. So that's one of the things that in particular we use our street millage for, is to help leverage those grants that we get. So those totals that you see on here would not include additional grant funding. Is that what you're asking?
Well, I was wondering how much more the grant might be, but it sounds like there's not a rule of thumb.
There's not. In general, one of our major grant funding sources for road improvements is our STP, our Surface Transportation Program, and that's federal aid money. On average, we get roughly about $2 million a year from that. It varies from year to year, but it averages out to around $2 million. Other grant funds are more individualized, competitive type grants, or one-off type grants. So it's a little bit harder to predict on an annual basis how much those would amount to.
Okay. And just while we're all together, I checked Legistar before the meeting started to see if there was anything about the Safe Routes to School Resolution 3 coming up for Monday. But while we're all together, do any of you folks have any updates on any negotiations or changes that have come about since the postponement?
No.
Okay, thanks.
Councilmember Griswold.
Given the time, I won't go into detail. I am the council member on the Transportation Commission, and also I am the Transportation Commission member looking at evaluation. I want to say that there was a time not too long ago when we weren't talking about pedestrian safety. Now we seem to mention pedestrian safety frequently, but we don't always have the data to back up the statement. But what I'm going to do is just schedule some time with CTN to talk about crosswalk safety and especially illumination. And I'll be bringing forward a resolution. I believe that we need to light all of our crosswalks, and that is a critical decision, and it's the responsibility of the council to say yes or no, rather than simply delegate that to staff and have them prioritize it, given the number of crashes we have had as a result of no lighting or poor lighting, either because we don't have a street light, or in some cases because the street light is simply out. So I'll bring that forward so we don't have to talk about it tonight. Thanks.
Nelson and Rumlawi.
Okay, mine is really quick. I just looked at my notes and I realized where I got mixed up. The two locations that were getting signal improvements. So which are the two,
Yes, and actually, I'm glad for your last question, too, because I misspoke. The 14 bump outs were the past work we did over the last 3 years. So that was 16, 17, 18. 19 actually doesn't have any bump outs identified, so my apologies. I did mix that up. That was crossing the streams in terms of what we reported on as past work versus this next coming year
Excellent,
work.
okay.
And then for the signal improvements, again, this is a massive spreadsheet, so it's probably best that I do send you that. After the meeting, we can give you that follow-up information.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Councilmember Rumlawi.
To get one more in, and I forgot to thank the staff early on for their work in this. Appreciate it, and the responses we got tonight were great. My question is about the train station and what our ongoing costs are going to be with that. You know, it's if I can ask Howard or someone else. I know that you know we have money that's been given to us by grants and already been allocated, but going forward, Councilmember Hayner brought up the issue of taking this to a vote, and that's you know, an issue that we need to talk about. And before we get there, I have no problem with delaying the vote as long as we're not spending any more money. And just like to know what additional new monies will be spent before it will be taken to a vote.
Well, I don't anticipate us spending any additional money to get through the process.
And there's no current ongoing expenses.
I'm sorry.
No more current expenditures that the city is taking on for.
No, the funds that have been allocated will be spent, but we are not coming back again for any adjustments to the budget.
Okay.
Just I want to be clear about that. The funds that are allocated will be expended.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Mr. Hess, you look like,
If I could just, you know, I know that, we all know this has been a controversial project. We also know that we spent a lot of money to get to where we want to go to so that we can put this before the voters, as was indicated in the council resolution. It's been a difficult road to get there. We've been through 2 government shutdowns that affected FRA. We've had a couple of changes along the route. At the end, having an approved environmental assessment allows us, with a preliminary engineering, allows us to go to the voters with enough bodies so that they can see what we're asking to approve. Having the approved EA also gives us a document that can be a launching point, not just for the preferred alternative, but should there be a change. So what we've tried to stress is that stopping before we get to that point means we get almost nothing of value for the money that we spent. So we got to get across that hurdle so that we can have a good discussion about what do we do next, whether we proceed with looking for future grant monies from the federal government, how far do we go, and then what is the reasonable short-term project that may get approved and may get constructed. So, you know, we all feel a little bit like Charlie Brown with Lucy holding the football, that every time we think we're at the end, something else happens. But, you know, I appreciate council's support as we've persevered to get to that point where we can have that discussion.
all right, let's, thank you very much. Let's roll now with groundwater.
This evening, if I could, we have
Please, thank you.
We have several people who have been engaged in this for a very, very long time, who, through council members Griswold and Eden, asked for the opportunity to come and talk before this work session. So the information that they're going to present is their own work. It's not necessarily been reviewed, supported, or endorsed by the city staff, but you know, with respect to the request from the council members, it's important that all points of view, all information is heard. So with that, I'll turn the podium over to Mr. Bicknell.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Dan Bicknell with Global Environment Alliance. As many of you may know, I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan School of Public Health in 1984 that discovered the Gelman dioxane contamination. So you can blame me. I would like to review the groundwater issues related to the Gelman Sciences dioxane pollution. The review would cover groundwater quality as well as the regulatory framework. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, appreciate it. The Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, called CERCLA, commonly known as Superfund, was enacted by Congress on December 11, 1980, to address the dangers of abandoned and uncontrolled toxic waste sites, which were not being properly managed by the states. It created a tax on chemical and petroleum industries and provided broad federal authority to respond directly to releases and threatened releases of hazardous substances that may endanger public health or the environment. In 1986, Congress passed Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, which increased the focus on human health as well as strengthened the CERCLA enforcement provisions. This administration proposed a 2020 budget of $1 billion for the Office of Superfund, which is an increase of 14% over the FY 2019 budget. There are two basic components to the Superfund CERCLA program. There's the side of the program which actually spends the Superfund money on cleaning up of the toxic waste sites, and there's the other side of the program that requires the viable polluters to remediate to CERCLA requirements. That's called the Superfund Enforcement Program. The Superfund Enforcement Program works with the Department of Justice and Office of Regional Counsel to require the potentially responsible parties, which is what they call the polluters, who cause the pollution to enter into a CERCLA administrative order doing the work that is required to US EPA requirements. The Superfund Enforcement Program will negotiate settlements and agreements and orders. Currently, about 70% of all the federal Superfund sites are in an enforcement program. They're not really being paid out of the Superfund pocket. As an example, since 1980, the Superfund Enforcement Program has obtained over $3.5 billion in potentially responsible party commitments for remedial work. Many people think that the Gelman site, for example, you'll end up spending money out of the Superfund, but odds are the enforcement program will take over because there is a viable party and really do the work. If the PRP, or polluter, refuses to conduct the remediation, US EPA will spend the Superfund money, and at the end of this, they'll bring a CERCLA recovery action against the polluter in federal court to recover the Superfund expended money. In 2018, as of 2018, they have spent, they've recovered about $7 billion. The Gelman site, which we're talking about here, has a viable, potentially responsible party who can pay for the remediation. Gelman Science was acquired by Paul Life Science, and it's now a subsidiary of Danaher. And Danaher is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. CERCLA holds current and past owners responsible for remedial work. To talk a little bit about the values relating to potential impacts from something be coined a Superfund site, the following entities looked at what would be any increase or decrease from having a site deemed a Superfund site. They are College of Holy Cross, University of Oregon, University of Colorado, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Their main findings were price appreciation from remediation is strongest for the worst sites. They also found the assumption that all Superfund sites negatively impact property values is not correct. They also found if consumers value the cleanup, then the models predict that it will lead to increase in local property prices. Further work was done recently by Duke and Pittsburgh universities, which found that once a site has all the remedies in place, nearby property values reflect a significant increase as compared to their values prior to the site becoming a Superfund site on the national priorities list. So on balance, they found having a professional US EPA cleanup will increase property values over the long term, and over the short term halt potential additional decreases in property values. As examples of where in Michigan we have Superfund sites that really have not caused a stigma to the community or its image, Charlevoix has Superfund sites, Sault Ste. Marie has Superfund site, Grand Ledge, Petoskey, Torch Lake, Asaba Township, Grand Traverse, and Rochester Hills. All of those are well-recognized in communities. To talk a little bit about the Gelman site, which is very important, of course, what we have is since 1988, it's been a Michigan contaminated site. The dioxin is moving in all directions, north, west, east, and south, with no effective off-site hydraulic control. It's moving into Scioto Township residential wells, Ann Arbor Charter Township residential wells, the City Old West Side, West Park, and moving towards Barton Pond. The US EPA has deemed dioxin to be a probable human carcinogen. As we'll see later, a large portion of the plume is over 1,000 parts per billion. However, US EPA drinking water criteria is 3.5 parts per billion at a 1 in 100,000 cancer risk. The state of Michigan at 7.2 at the same risk level. The Virginia Department of Environmental Quality has looked at workers in a trench who are exposed to groundwater, and they have determined that the safe level is 353 parts per billion. Currently, we're under a 1992 court judgment between Gelman and DEQ. The original objectives of that were to remove, treat, and dispose of the contaminated groundwater and contain the plume and extract the contaminated groundwater from the aquifers. However, since '92, DEQ has lost many actions in court against Gelman, and now we're dealing with what the DEQ has coined a dispersion dilution remedy, which allows the mixing of a pristine aquifer with the dioxin plume as it moves through the city towards the Huron River. This figure shows the plume. The plume is approximately 4 miles long and a mile wide. This is the Gelman property here, the origin of the contamination, and this, as you all know, is Barton Pond, which is a main city drinking water source. You can see here the concentrations, 1,000, 2,000 are in the brighter colors, and note again that the DEQ drinking water criteria is 7.2 parts per billion. So we're dealing with a massive problem. It is migrating again in all directions. If we look at the northern edge of the plume, currently the known dioxin leading edge is approximately 1.5 miles northeast of the property, Gelman property, or about halfway to Barton Pond, which is about 3.1 miles from the Gelman property. You can see again by looking at the color code that there are very significant concentrations that are moving in this general direction, as well as moving over towards the city, Old West Side, and West Park areas, which we'll talk about in a second, please. There's a problem, though, for us here. We have a northern boundary monitoring wells, but these northern boundary wells, for example, this red dash is the expanded prohibition zone. That's the boundary where below that it is regulated to 2,800 parts per billion, and above that it's regulated to drinking water. However, what we're depending upon is this monitoring well here, 120D, and a mile away, this monitoring well here, 135, to follow what's going to be going towards Barton Pond. And what you see here is that the distance is just too large, it's a whole mile, to determine whether there are different glacial till channels moving from this contamination past the boundary towards Barton Pond. And this has been discussed many times in various meetings we've had with the DEQ. One of the meetings that we had was at the CARD meeting, the Coalition for Action to Remediate Dioxin. And in 2016, Dr. Lawrence Lemke with Wayne State University was asked the question, could Barton Pond potentially become impacted? The DEQ indicated previously to that it was not likely or possible. But what Dr. Lemke indicated, that if the dioxin plume were to move to the M14 water treatment plant impoundment area, it would easily then go to Barton Pond. The head differential here is 150 feet, which is significant. Currently, the known dioxin plume edge is about 0.65 miles from this location. If we look at other areas where the plume is migrating, one of the most sensitive areas is Scioto Township, where they have no existing alternative water supply. This is the plume here, and you can see the higher concentrations, as we looked at earlier, coming behind it. Elizabeth Road has had the dioxin contamination in it, or residents of the area have had dioxin contamination in their residential wells for many years. And as you can see, the historical data, it has ranged from 1 to 4. Again, the drinking water criteria now is 7.2. So those levels, even though they're low, are significant when you're dealing with a 7.2 part per billion level. And as you can see, the plume is getting ready to continually to migrate in this area, and there's nothing that's stopping it. There are no extraction wells in this area. It's just freely migrating to the north. This is a figure showing the Ann Arbor Charter Township residential wells, same situation as Scioto Township wells. As the plume moves, in theory, towards the river, which is what everyone is being told, and it's moving that way, these wells are unprotected. They're, as you know, outside of the city, and so their drinking water, they're their only supply for drinking water. Again, you can see that it's a very serious situation. If we turn back to what we have here in the city, this is a view of the Old West Side and West Park. You can see the Vets Park area on the left and West Park on the right. I have indicated 2 monitoring wells that are both in the shallow groundwater, 83 and 82S. I've also indicated that there's an extraction well here in the lower left. That is the last extraction well that there is. So moving through from Maple Road through here, there's nothing that's stopping the contamination. It's flowing freely. And as a matter of fact, if I might, this extraction well pumps 30 gallons per minute, okay? Your average garden hose pumps, if it's a 25-foot garden hose, 25 gallons per minute. So this extraction well, which they're counting on to stop, halt, migrate, protect us, is little more than a garden hose volume coming out of it. Again, you can see the concentrations that are moving through. The concentrations need to be compared to the 7.2 drinking water criteria. In between 82S and West Park, there are no monitoring wells. So all of this is theoretical, based on just general groundwater hydrology. However, in 2016, there was some borings done by DEQ, and they found that dioxin was at 1.1 and 3.3 parts per billion in groundwater by Slauson School, less than 10 feet from the surface. So while normally you're thinking that the groundwater is deep, here, actually in this area, as it moves through the city, as we'll see in a second, it's actually getting very close to the surface. In fact, in 2019, they found 18 parts per billion dioxin in the stormwater in the Allen Creek drain at West Park. Excuse me. This shows us from, again, on the left, Vets Park to West Park, groundwater flow from west to east, the kind of topography we're dealing with. As we all know, Vets Park is in a higher area of elevation, and West Park is in a lower elevation area. And as we look at the plume here, in the yellow area, which is the, I'll call it the shallow portion of the glacial till aquifer, you can see that the concentrations are higher by monitoring well 83 recently, and moving more elevated towards 82. And they're moving down again, this shallow groundwater is moving down again towards West Park. But what's happening is up in the Vets Park area, it's 65 feet to groundwater. So there's really not a lot of risk to the residents, not a lot of risk to buildings and workers. But as you go down closer to West Park, you get into a 20 feet below groundwater, and then at West Park, it's 10 feet and less below groundwater. If we look at the concentrations that are going from Vets Park to West Park, you see these graphs that were generated by the DEQ. And they are, again, historical data from monitoring well 83 and monitoring well 82. And the shallow portion of the plume has migrated from 83 to 82, a distance of 2,100 feet. And now 82 concentrations are moving to West Park. You can see here in 2010, it was about 650, and it's moving now over towards monitoring well 82, and here it's about 350. And groundwater flows like a river. It's the same thing as a river, except it's going through the ground. So as you would envision this being a river and the river flowing, it's going from up gradient to down gradient. It's going from west to east. It's going from high topography to low topography. And again, we're not understanding what is really going around West Park because for 2,800 feet, you have no monitoring wells. You have no shallow, groundwater monitoring wells. It's a very big data deficiency. And this has been raised many times to the agencies. If we look at where we are here administratively, there's a court judgment that was entered into between DEQ and Gelman. And right now, really many people, including city attorneys, county attorneys, in their briefs to become an intervener, have concluded that this consent judgment is not protective of public health, reasonable, or consistent with other remedies. Why? Because mainly the DEQ has generated a dilution dispersion remedy off the Gelman site. If, as we looked at before, if you go east of Wagner Road, through the city, through the Prohibition Zone, it's migrating without impedance towards Barton Pond, through residential neighborhoods, and contaminating utilities and potentially people's homes in these lower areas. The risks are to municipal water supplies, building occupants from dioxane vapor intrusion, and workers in the trench who come into contact with polluted water. If you look at what's happening to the west of Wagner Road, it's just freely moving towards the Scioto Township, towards Scioto Township, where they have no protection against this contamination continuing to go into residential wells. There is a prohibition zone, and within this prohibition zone, as you can see in the red outline, the cleanup level is 2,800 parts per billion. But remember that the DEQ drinking water criteria is 7.2. And these levels are not protective of a utility worker in a trench, which is approximately 353, but yet it's allowed to move all the way through this prohibition zone at 2,800. The current CJ has an unprotective and outdated groundwater surface water interface value. That's the 2,800. The new value as of 2018 is 280. So I know people are trying to get the thing changed for it to be 280 instead of 2,800, but there's been a lot of resistance by DEQ on that. There's also a provision in the CJ that if Gelman would like, it can unilaterally expand the prohibition zone. So let's say that the pollution continues to go to the north. They have the right underneath the consent judgment to unilaterally say, well, that's a prohibition zone. We're going to expand it up in that area. Just as they did here between this dark red area and the pink area. That's where they expanded the prohibition zone to take on the evergreen residential community. There are no monitoring wells, as we talked about, to delineate the extent and magnitude. There's no protection of water supplies. There's no action protection for vapor intrusion or workers in the trench. And it's sad to say that Gelman is not even paying for residential well sampling of people in the townships that are being impacted by this. Each individual is required to take their own sample, have it submitted to a lab at their cost, and then report the findings to the state or the county if they like, or if they don't, they just keep it to themselves. If, however, this Gelman site became a US EPA Superfund site, the current consent judgment would be replaced by a federal CERCLA administrative order. Well, what would that mean?
Nothing. It means nothing.
The main benefits of a US EPA Superfund site were illuminated in Region 5 in 2016 by the US EPA. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. And there was a call meeting between county, city, and township representatives with US EPA. And US EPA indicated that if they were to make this into a US EPA Superfund site, there would be active restoration of the aquifer to a protective drinking water criteria, regardless of whether the plume was in a prohibition zone or not. So everywhere through the city, EPA would restore the aquifer to drinking water quality. Also, as a first priority, they would extend the municipal drinking water supply to any resident who may be potentially adversely impacted by the dioxane, such as people in Scioto Township. They would halt the expansion of the dioxane plume and treat the source and outer margin. This would prevent the dioxane contamination from reaching Barton Pond. They would ask Gelman to pay for residential well sampling and analysis, and they would require a monitoring well network, which would get us the full extent and magnitude of the plume, including where is it in the Old West Side and the West Park area. US EPA offers a community grant, initial one is $50,000, to support public input into the Superfund cleanup process. US EPA has the technical, administrative, and legal resources to establish this administrative order and provide the high-quality oversight of Gelman, with the Department of Justice backing and the Office of Regional Counsel backing. This is not new to us because we've been dealing with this for a long time. And in particular, back in 2016, there was discussions between the city, county, townships on which way to go. And there were two paths that were looked at. There was the intervener path, going to court, trying to get Gelman to do the right thing. And then there was the Superfund path. Well, I'd like to look at where we are today. You have the county and the city filed petitions in 2016. Together, all the interveners have expended hundreds of internal legal staff and technical staff time. And as of March 2019, they spent about $800,000 on outside counsel and consultants to file motions and negotiate with Gelman, the DEQ, and the DEQ to modify the CJ. In 2017, the county, township, Huron River Watershed Council got approval from the circuit court as interveners, but that was followed immediately by Gelman challenging the city, county, Scioto Township intervention in the appellate court and then the Supreme Court. DEQ challenged the Huron River Watershed Council intervention in the appellate court and then the Supreme Court. However, finally, the interveners obtained proper status in early 2018. Well, over 2018 and early 19, what has happened on the intervener path? A protracted negotiation to modify unsound CJ terms and conditions, and more likely, lengthy litigation in the circuit, appellate, and Supreme Courts, with little material change in the CJ. DEQ has stated many times that their dilution dispersion remedy is consistent with state environmental law. So the current remedy will not change, in their view, in any negotiations or any court actions. The petitioners are, at that time, Scioto Township, Ann Arbor Charter Township, and the Sierra Club. and they filed a petition for US EPA to conduct a preliminary assessment to make the Gelman site into a US EPA Superfund site November 2016. US EPA accepted the petitioner's request and completed their preliminary assessment in November 2017. Their conclusion was that the Gelman site does qualify for potential listing as a US EPA Superfund site. As we talked about before, their actions would restore the aquifer to drinking water quality, extend municipal drinking water lines, halt the expansion of the plume, and have active remediation to protect Barton Pond. However, these actions were not taken. Rather, they were told by DEQ that the governor would not accept, which he at that time needed to move forward with this becoming a Superfund site. If it did become a Superfund site, the protective actions that we talked about would limit any future reductions in property values. But US EPA reserved its right. With an acceptance letter from the governor, we can restart the Superfund designation process. And right now, there's no need to collect any additional data. All that's needed is a letter from the governor saying that she concurs to continue the designation process. So in summary, what we see is the Gelman plume is migrating in all directions with no effective off-site hydraulic control. It's moving toward residential wells, the Old West Side, West Park, Barton Pond, and that dioxane is a probable human carcinogen with a drinking water criteria of about 7.2. The high dioxane groundwater concentrations moving into the lower area of the city in Old West Side and the West Park are coming close to the surface, and therefore potential risks deal with them causing risk to homeowner, risk to vapor intrusion and workers in a trench in the Old West Side and West Park. Outside of that, in the Scioto Township and Ann Arbor Township, they're presenting risks to private drinking water wells. We see that the current state regulatory framework for the CJ allows the plume to migrate freely through the city in a dilution dispersion action. The alternative federal regulatory option is in the Superfund enforcement program, which would issue an administrative order to Gelman compelling a halt in the plume migration and actively remediating the aquifer to drinking water quality. Again, this federal administrative order would replace the current CJ. And additionally, these actions, as seen by university research, would provide a positive action which would limit property values. Roger Rail is going to be able to show us a couple of figures here on how the plume is migrating through the area. Roger?
Yeah. So I'm Roger Rail. I actually live in Scioto Township, but I used to live in the city in an area that's now affected by the plume. I got involved in '93 thinking that, okay, I'm a problem solver, I can help define what the problem is, gather facts, come up with alternative solutions, and go to, quote, the decision maker and help them make decisions. I figured I'd be back at work in a year. It's 26 years later, and I'm still trying to help decision makers do the right thing and pull information together from various sources, present it in a way that anybody can understand what's really happening. A lot of the information we get from the company and from the DQ is really confusing. It's hard to grasp. We get maps on paper, or, you know, a piece of the plume is here, another piece here on another piece of paper. You can't really put it together in your head. So I've used Google Earth as a platform, and before that, giant whiteboards with hand-drawn maps and scaled-up maps from the paper copies. But so,
Sorry, my friend. I apologize.
oh,
Yeah.
oh, you click this first, okay.
The mouse up there.
All right. I'm told this will Hooray has a few short videos that show the animation of the dioxane over time. So every time you see a white donut, that's a well that has its highest ever concentration for that year. I'll play this again now that it's up on the screen. It's up, yeah. So you can see with your own eyes where the dioxane is going up. And it's like Dan says, it's here and there, everywhere. It's time after 20-some years, 25, 30 years of trying to clean this up using the existing state agencies to get higher power involved. And the EPA is the only one, I think, with the wherewithal to make the polluter do what's necessary. As originally, I was not in favor of the Superfund, but over the years, I've come to understand that for a situation like this, where there's a responsible party with the means to pay, Superfund is the only one that can make them do that. The DEQ doesn't have the power. The state of Michigan doesn't have the wherewithal to make a giant company like Danaher, Paul, Gelman do what's necessary. It's going to take a lot of effort by all the units of government still, even after the EPA is involved, to provide them with the needed information that each unit of government has. And as I've been saying for the last couple of years, everybody at all levels of government has to do their due diligence to match the scale of this problem, because this is probably the largest 1,4-dioxane contamination of its type in the country, if not the world. And regarding Dan, if he hadn't have found this as a student, when would it have been found? How much worse would it be today if it had been going on for another 25, 30 years? Think of the scale of that. And how would we ever recover from that? At least now, we still have a manageable size problem. We're not like Tucson where we caught it too late. We can keep this from getting into our water.
It is in our water.
Well, it's in the groundwater, and it's in some wells. It's in a handful of wells. Please get the information correct. And by the way, this image that you have here, if you would please give attribution to CIRS versus Safe Water for using that, because I don't want it associated with disinformation.
Roger, Vince was going to talk a little bit about stormwater.
Yeah. So I'll be around for any questions. Vince is now going to talk about stormwater. There's a couple other videos here that seem to have gone away, but they'll be up on the SRSW website for anybody that wants to see them. If you go to the srsw.org, you'll see a link on the landing page for these latest videos to see not only where the highest dioxin concentrations are, but also the very high concentration that's still left in various areas as the plume moves. So here's Vince Caruso to talk about near-surface groundwater issues.
Hi, I'm Vince Caruso, founding and board member of CARD, founding and coordinating member for the Allen Creek Watershed Group. So Paul's own map that Dan showed with the slice through the earth, so to speak, and seeing layers like a cake was produced in 2006, according to that map. So we have a very steep watershed in the Allen Creek Watershed Group. It drops away very quickly. It's very flashy. And what has happened, according to that depiction, is that it exposes layers of our glacial till, which is what Ann Arbor is, a glacial till. One of the glaciers stopped here, and there's all kinds of soil types, and there's layers. At West Park, I was riding my bike a couple Januaries, 2 Januaries ago, and it was not snowy or anything. I'm riding along, this big piece of ice got, in front of me, and I went flying. And where's that water coming from? There's no rain. And I realized that it was a seep coming out of the hillside and was freezing as it went across the path. And I thought, that probably should be tested, because here it is, groundwater coming out of the hillside. So the CARD group, the Allen's Creek group, tried to work with the DEQ to get a reasonable test of the near-surface groundwater. After that, it took a lot of pushing, and one thing we decided, and I thought was a good idea, that we should have the DEQ basically just test the creek coming out or coming through West Park. I know from talking with a former drain commissioner officer that that pipe at West Park that they tested has a lot of stubs sticking out of the pipe that pick up groundwater, because there's a lot of undermining of basements, undermining of roadways. So when they put that pipe in, they grabbed a lot of these seeps in the area. So during a drought, you can stand over that grate and hear water gushing through there. And there's a couple sites like that in Ann Arbor where you can just stand at a really deep drought, and it's water's gushing through there. It's groundwater working its way towards the river. So the city staff was very good about helping the DEQ when they finally decided that would be a reasonable test. City staff came out and they tested the water at Allen's Creek at West Park and found initially 4.4 part per billion. 8 months later at that same site, they found 19 parts per billion. So that's about 10 feet underground, and it's water coming from the west towards the east towards the river. And there's some talk of why aren't they doing these tests and finding it upstream of West Park. And so if you look at that map again, you would see that as you go up the hill, you're getting farther and farther away from those layers that contain the groundwater that is contaminated. So we saw this large, what I would consider a pretty high level, 19 part per billion in West Park, and I was pretty surprised by that. So 11 blocks up from West Park, you have Vets Park. And close to Vets Park, there's about 1,000 part per billion just west of this site, 11 blocks. So we also have a situation with Slauson Middle School area. And now we're finding near my house on Glendale and Abbott, we have monitoring well 103S, S indicating it's shallow, and it's 50 feet below the groundwater. It has hit 85 part per billion twice now in 2 tests recently. So here we are in Glendale area at 85 part per billion, moving, in my opinion, towards Slauson and beyond, where the water at Slauson that was tested at a couple part per billion near the surface. So at Glendale, it's just 50 feet, like I said, below the surface. Could be higher. The well is testing at 50 feet, and it's difficult for them to change that. So hard to know exactly how deep the contamination is. There is still no reasonable, in my opinion, and CARD's opinion, a reasonable plan to test this near surface groundwater. The DEQ is doing very simplistic creek tests. They're working with Evan Pratt. Unfortunately, that decision did not come to the Allen's Creek group. We were not advised or asked about that more involved plan to test more creek outlets. So Roger asked me, so how do we know that homeowners are going to have trouble if this gets near the surface? And I'm showing you a map that we had shown City Council before for a development that was up on our street, a memory care center up on Glendale. So the neighbors, and I didn't do the survey, the neighbors did the survey. I talked to them that these surveys can be very valuable. So they went door to door in our neighborhood. This is like 4 blocks, 5 blocks. This is Glendale here. This is where development wanted to go. This is Jackson up here. I live down over here. So the red means a wet basement or water in the basement. Black means, or green means it's in the yard. Black means it's sewage, mixed with stormwater, and the open stop sign is nothing. So if you look at the red ones, those are probably wet basements, either getting wet through groundwater or other means. And there are places where I'm sure there's downspouts that are causing trouble for the houses, and that could be addressed. But there was a house recently built right down on Abbott at Virginia. They dug that basement hole for that house. This is a $900,000 house that was built. Dug that hole, within a few days it filled up with water. And one of the reasons I know that it filled up with water is because I was walking down there and a neighbor said, can somebody talk to this builder and block off that basement? Because our kids are going to fall into that water, 4 feet of water, and drown. And so I went and talked to the builder, said, yeah, okay, I'll fence it off. So here's a house that's going in this neighborhood, that the groundwater is so high that they dug the foundation. In a couple of days, it fills up with water. So they're constantly pumping the water out, which was a problem, and the city had to deal with that. So there are many areas in the city that have groundwater problems that I'm aware of. You know, Merrifield Park, which is over west of West Park, most of the basements in one neighborhood that I'm aware of have had their basements replaced because of groundwater infiltration. There's a person, I'm not going to name his name, but who in the Old West Side has a Michigan basement, wants to dig it out and started digging, and within a foot or two, he hit groundwater. So here he has a basement that's full of dirt, wanted to get the dirt out. Now he's hit water, and he stopped and said, wait a minute, and he knows about this situation. And he said, I got to find out. And even today I got an email. He said, I'm still not sure what I'm going to do about my basement. I'd like to have a regular basement, but I'm worried about the groundwater issues as well as the contamination. So the Old West Side, being with the watershed group all these years, 20 years or more, it's a lot of groundwater issues on the Old West Side. A lot of homes with wet basements, a lot of homes that have deal with infiltration routinely. And that's one of the fears we have. And just happens that we have a Dr. Bob Bailey with the CARD group, who has his PhD in inorganic chemistry. He worked with Dow Chemical for 30 years. He's an environmental chemist. He lives in Sunward Co-housing right now, which has a Gelman monitoring well on its site, which they were not too thrilled with. He's a CARD member, and we had talked about this near-surface groundwater contamination and what happens when it might infiltrate into the basement of these homes. And so there's a condition which is called vapor intrusion, where normally you have gasoline or other solvents actually volatilize and come into the basement. And we're having that situation up in Petoskey where they built condominiums on top of an old dump site, and these vapors are coming up through the basement. They had to evacuate 14 of the 16 condominiums to try and deal with that vapor intrusion. In this situation, the 1,4-dioxane is a solvent, but it's a very weak solvent in its vapor pressure. So what would happen is it would come in with the water. When the water evaporates, the 1,4-dioxane would evaporate. So one of the problems with this chemical is it's very miscible in water. It stays with water. It's hard. Once it's in the water, it's hard to get it out. So he did some very detailed analysis. He has a draft analysis. The DEQ is setting 1900s at a 1900 part per billion as a vapor intrusion action standard, meaning that they would need to do something. It wouldn't necessarily mean the basement would be closed off or anything, but 1900 is their action level. He came back and determined from his analysis that it's probably closer to 100 part per billion, not 1900. We provided that draft to the DEQ. They're going to look it over. Just recently we submitted that. So in short, it's almost obvious to the CARD group that the DEQ is not capable of dealing with this contamination. For example, Bob Wagner, who's a deputy director for the MDEQ until he retired a year or so ago, was at a town hall meeting in Ann Arbor in 2016, and he said to the group, don't worry about Barton. Barton has a natural blocking agent, meaning that the dioxin and the contaminated water will not get into Barton because it has, in his mind, all this water pressure pushing out. Dr. Larry Lemke was at that meeting, and just happens Dr. Larry Lemke came to the next CARD meeting a week later. So Dr. Lemke got a U of M PhD, worked at Wayne State as an ecogeologist, and now he's chair at CMU, Central Michigan University, in their geology environmental department. So I asked Dr. Lemke at the CARD meeting a week later, I said, so, you know, Bob Wagner talked about a natural blocking agent blocking this flow. What do you think of that, Dr. Lemke? And he did not pause 1 minute. He said, that's not true. There is no such thing. There is no blocking agent at that dam that will stop this contamination from getting into Barton. In fact, he said there, like Dan McNell showed you, there's actually a preferred path. Once it gets past M14, it's a downhill run into Barton Pond, because that's just the way the water wants to go. It wants to go to the river. It's been doing that for millennia. It's going to keep doing that. And once, you know, we get to that point, he thinks there's a very strong possibility that it'll go very quickly into Barton. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for having this working session. I'll be here for questions if you have any.
As Brian gets ready to speak, I just want to be clear that Brian's going to talk about protection of the city's drinking water supply. It's not a repudiation or anything in contrast to what was just said. It's a very focused set of discussion about the actions the city is taking to make sure we retain a safe and reliable source of drinking water.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. I have only a few minutes worth of comments and also be around for questions. As you all know, with Matt Naud's retirement in December, I've been tasked with leading the city's non-legal efforts associated with addressing the 1,4-dioxane and the Gelman plume. And one of the things that the city administrator, I think, mentioned when you were all informed of that was that we were going to pursue bringing in some support to help us navigate the technical side of this quite complicated issue. So since that time, over the past few months, we've engaged a professional hydrogeologist from Tetra Tech. Her name is Patty McCall, and she's here with me tonight. I just wanted to introduce her to you. She has over 17 years of experience as a professional hydrogeologist, more than 10 years with Tetra Tech, and also has some institutional knowledge on this very issue. So we've been very fortunate to have her sort of join our team and help us as we navigate some of the technical issues that I'm sure we're going to be facing down the road. Some actions that I have taken personally since the transition. I've spent, first of all, a fair bit of time with Matt Naud before he retired and picked his brain as much as possible, and he's also indicated that he's available to me if questions arise in the future. So thanks, Matt, if you're watching, for that. But I've also taken the opportunity to meet with several stakeholders. I spent a few hours meeting with Mr. Roger Rail, who addressed you earlier, and getting some more information on the tremendous amount of work that he's done over the years to track this issue. I've also spent some time, several hours, with the leadership at MDEQ who are overseeing this issue. So I've been engaging with them to understand their perspective on where we're at. The Washtenaw County Drain Commissioner, the Washtenaw County Health Department, Huron River Watershed Council. So a reasonable amount of time reaching out to our stakeholders to understand and get a grasp on this issue. And also, I've been involved, I've been with the city for over 20 years, so this isn't something that's completely new to me. I haven't been intimately involved in it to the depth of Matt Naud, but I've been involved sort of on the periphery. I want to talk to you for a couple minutes about what the city's action plan is moving forward, and specifically the non-legal side of the action plan. I know you've all been briefed by the city attorney and are familiar with the legal issues that are in front of you. But on the non-legal side, I want to mention four specific things that we're working on. One is to ensure that we have sufficient monitoring wells in place to provide the city an early warning. And when I say early warning, I mean years to even decades of notice before we would have to potentially implement any type of contingency plan. I'll talk more about the contingency plan in a minute. Second, to advocate for better delineation of the plume within the context of the new state regulatory cleanup standards. We also are planning on developing a contingency plan to address the removal at the water treatment plant of 1,4-dioxane and needed. And note that as part of past work, we already have some capability at the treatment plant as it currently exists to remove some 1,4-dioxane. Our current treatment can remove somewhere in the 40 to 70% of what's coming into the plant. And with the current plant improvements projects, which we are all, I think, familiar with because we've been talking to you about our capital needs, we will be well positioned to implement any additional treatment as needed. So we wouldn't be moving forward with implementing anything until needed, and we would anticipate that we'd have sufficient time to make those decisions and implement it if necessary. And then lastly, the thing I wanted to mention is that within the appropriate legal and regulatory context, the city will seek the best way to address the open NPDES permit for discharge from the Gelman's groundwater treatment plant into Honey Creek. So those are the main things that we have on our sort of strategy moving forward. And then just lastly, I want to mention that I've been privileged to be the custodian of the city's drinking water supply, and I've been in this role for about 5 years, though I've been working for the city for over 20 years at the drinking water treatment plant. We take protecting the city's drinking water supply very seriously, and I am not only working for the city, but I'm also a customer and have been a customer of the city's water system for 20 years. I understand the communities and our customers' need for transparency and their concern about water quality. And on May 1st of this year, we'll be issuing our first monthly water quality report to our customers to ensure that our customers have access to current information about their drinking water. Previously to this, and by statute, we are required to issue a report annually, but we are going to be issuing a report monthly. Access to our water quality data and current events, all things water, will be incorporated into that new water quality report. We've currently procured a new URL called qualitywatermatters.org, so that will be the link to this new report. And city staff is available to answer any questions that council may have as you consider the city's drinking water moving forward as part of future meetings. And we believe with Tetra Tech's and Ms. McCall's support that we're well positioned with the resources we need and will be available to answer any technical questions that you might have in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We are, thank you.
Yep.
And, in total, thank all speakers. This is very helpful. Thank you very much. We are, of course, beyond where we're supposed to be with respect to work sessions. I know that we probably all ourselves have, multiple questions. I guess what might be most efficient to make sure that we have public speakers who want to, members from the public who want to have public comment, and then a couple of questions here. Maybe I'd suggest, since the groundwater issues are most, percolating in the Fifth Ward, that we have Fifth Ward members ask questions if they want in this context, and then we'll have public comment, and then the others of us who have written questions can distribute them to the group, and we'll go in that route. Is that satisfactory?
I just want to say thank you. Oh. Yeah, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who spoke tonight, since I was one of the people who asked that this topic be discussed. And I also want to say that I have complete confidence in Brian Steglitz and the water treatment facility. When people call me and say, Kathy, what should I do? Should I go to bottled water? I say, no, there's more bacteria. Keep drinking the Ann Arbor water. So thank you very much.
What she said. Our Fifth Ward colleagues, are there questions you want raised here, or do you want to?
Well, I think it would be only responsible to at least a couple.
Bring it.
Staff had talked about early warning monitoring wells. Where are we in that process? How many wells will there be? Earlier discussion said there was a mile between certain wells. So can you help us explain how, we have a lot of cries for more monitoring wells and a lot of difficulty executing it, and and I know this is the non-legal side of things. So on the non-legal, how many of those and when are they going to be implemented if they haven't already?
Well, they haven't already. So that's one of our first tasks that we have with Tetra Tech is to look at that very issue. So it's one thing that Patty McCall is working on is to look at, what are the gaps? Where do we need wells? So I don't have an answer for you right now, but we can, as we develop that scope of work, we can come up with the milestone schedule, talk about what the content is, and share the plan. At this point, I anticipate it's probably going to be towards the end of this fiscal year before we'll have something that we'll be able to share. So we have a few months probably of pulling together the information we need, and we'll be getting back to council with that.
You'd also said that you felt pretty confident there'd be time to react to the dangers if it breached and entered a situation where we would have to treat it at the plant. What gives you the confidence that it would be decades?
The hydrogeologic information that we've seen to date, the model that some of the previous speakers spoke about, and just the current science that's what it's illustrating to us right now.
And I guess I'll allow my colleague to have some time if you have a question on. And I mean, we know that in Tucson, they treat the dioxin at the water plant, and it's very expensive. We're going to be set to vote on more rate increases here. It's actually on the upcoming agenda. What is going to be the additional costs for the users of the system if it gets to that point? I mean, what are we talking about? Doubling the rates on people if it does come down to treating it at the plant?
In terms of what the impact is on an individual customer, I'll have to get back to you on that. But we have current estimates of approximately an additional $10 million to build any infrastructure on top of what our current capital needs are if we needed to treat 1,4-dioxane at the water treatment plant.
So it's going to be built into the initial plans, but we're not going to act on it until it becomes something that we need to act on. And when we do act on it, it'll be an additional $10 million to do that, is what you're...
That's the current information we have right now, correct.
But to treat it, to actually treat the water, you don't know how much more expensive it would. And we understand the hardware will be roughly $10 million, but the actual ongoing cost of treating the water, we don't know that yet.
Well, right now, our current process has some treatment for the 1,4-dioxane, but if we were going to have to build treatment specifically for it, which at this point we don't anticipate that we'd need to do, we estimate that it would be an additional approximately $10 million of capital investment. And I could come back to you, to council, with what that would translate into what an average customer's bill. I don't have that at my fingertips if you wanted to know what that would mean in terms of a rate impact. It would not be a doubling. No, I mean, it's significantly less substantial than that.
All right, well, I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on it, and I appreciate the fact that we'll be getting monthly reports instead of the just mandated annual ones.
Councilor Smith? All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, very helpful, and we'll run council questions through staff to get to card and speakers, and then get that back and circulate it to the group. Thank you. We now come to public comment general time. Public comment general time is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to council and the community about matters of municipal interest. To speak at public comment general time, one need not have signed up in advance. Speakers have 3 minutes in which to speak, so please pay close attention to the time clock. As a matter of courtesy, we may have only one person speaking at a time. And finally, if you require assistance in speaking before council, we'd be delighted to provide it to you. Is there anyone who'd like to speak at public comment? Please just come right on up.
Thank you. With all due respect to so many people who have known about this plume for decades and who have collected data to generate this map, which Mr. Riley, Jeff Rail has, I want to give him the credit. I've always acknowledged that this is the map that he made, and we are thankful to him. And also to the gentleman who actually figured out that this plume is, we're living on it, because as he said, we would never have known about it. So why is it that after over 30 years, with all these people who have been involved, knowing about it, monitoring how it moves, why is it that every day we find ourselves in a bigger and bigger problem with dioxin in our waters? Why is that? I want to suggest that that is because our system of governance, up, down, left, right, favors the rich and ditches the poor. And this is not an unknown phenomenon to American politics. Money talks, and that is very sad, because when that happens, the public gets left behind over and over again. With all due respect about this, it is no big feather in anybody's cap when they say they have been involved in this catastrophe for decades, yet we find ourselves in this horrific situation, the biggest, most god-awful dioxin contamination in the world. It's no feather in anybody's cap when you say that you have been involved in it, yet it has only been growing. And now we see that the solution to it is put to us by telling us we want to put it on a federal Superfund list. Anybody who knows anything about the state and the atmosphere in the Department of EPA today under Trump, anybody who knows what is happening, and I've emailed all of you about this in detail, providing specific links for you to know what I'm talking about. With the situation with the Department of Environmental Quality and with EPA, you can be sure that putting Ann Arbor dioxin plume, Gelman dioxin plume, on Superfund list will make very little, if any, difference. It will allow years and years of delay in cleaning up this plume. It will not jump and clean up our waters. I am saying we must put
Thank you.
a millage to the voters.
Thank you.
And get the money and clean it up ourselves.
Thank you.
We cannot wait any longer.
Thank you, ma'am.
While this thing goes on federal Superfund list. It will do us no good.
Thank you.
Clean it up now.
Hi, Vince Crusoe. I just want to make a comment about the DT site. I'm glad to see that the berm is being, the tunnel's being put in the berm. I think that's going to be great. I attended a lot of the meetings and pushed hard if we were going to put in an opening, that would be great, but we also needed a pedestrian access, which also happened, which is really great. And a close to, or maybe more, 6-foot drop in floodplain elevation at that site will take many homes out of the floodplain, will really, I think, help that neighborhood out tremendously. I have issues with the fact that that site is heavily polluted, the DT site. It's sitting on top of the old riverbed, where the riverbed was actually moved. If you go to our website, acwg.org, you can see, it's an old image that is stored at the library. And I attended most of the meetings, probably all the meetings that the developer had. They said that the groundwater at that site is contaminated with coal tar. I have someone in the watershed group who actually worked on the sheet piling that went in at the Allens Creek. When they put in that sheet piling, they dug down, I think about 10 feet. It was black as night all the way down. Said it was god-awful. They could hardly do the work because so much odor was coming off the coal tar. So they say that the developer says that they know the groundwater under that site is contaminated. They have not tested whether it's leaving the site, which even that would be a violation of Michigan's very weak Part 201 law. And that's basically what's happening with dioxin. As long as you isolate it, that's Michigan's very weak Part 201. So I would like to see this site cleaned up. I think DTE is a responsible party. They should be the ones, they're a mega millionaire company. They could afford to clean up the site. They bought it, they own it, they are the responsible party. The taxpayer should not be bailing out DTE and cleaning up this site or leaving Ann Arbor with a mess to clean up later in years to come, when we do find out that it probably is contaminating the river. As a lot of the groundwater will travel down an old riverbed because that's where groundwater wants to go. So I'm almost certain that the groundwater under that site is leaving and moving down the river and is not and is contaminating the river, and that violates Michigan law. They should be forced to make those tests. I think if we're doing a project with the pedestrian access, I think that's great, but where that's going is over one of the areas that's very heavily contaminated. And I think the city needs to do its due diligence and make a determination as to whether that should be cleaned up first before we build something new on top of it. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm stunned by the $170 million price tag, if that's accurate. It shouldn't take a FOIA to release that information. I'm worried that a double track in the future, and I worry about how a double track will cut off pedestrian traffic even more between North Campus and Central Campus via the U of M Arb. With the push for train improvements, I hope that you're not forgetting pedestrian traffic in this region. In particular, I'm asking that when you look into more pedestrian bridges, then don't forget into looking into placing a legal bridge crossing where the Huron River, the B2B Trail, the U of M Arboretum, and the train tracks meet. It's important that we don't forget about that spot. I'm not against the location of the train station, but with a price tag that high, please make sure that you're including this particular bridge in that calculation. I appreciate the work that CARD and others are doing on the 1,4-dioxane. From my perspective, Dan, Roger, Vince, and others should get the key to the city for their work on it. I have one minor comment to make, and that relates to the reference made about Sault Ste. Marie in the presentation and how that relates to Superfund sites and land values. I lived in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, but there were numerous times that I drove my bike around Sault, Michigan. Back then, it was quite easy to cross the border and spend time in either Canada or the USA. I remember riding my bike near the Superfund site quite often, and I should point out that in the Sault, the site has no development, and any houses near that site are incredibly cheap as compared to the rest of the city. I'm not convinced, based on my experience from the Sault, that a Superfund site in Ann Arbor would help with property values. There might be some cities where it has helped, but it didn't help the Sault, at least with property values. In that area, I see cheap houses and the land isn't development. And from my understanding, that particular site should be delisted soon as a Superfund site, and in that perspective, it will help with property values. I'm all in favor of cleaning the 1,4-dioxane and making Danaher pay, but based partially on my experience from the Sault, I'm against the Superfund site in Ann Arbor.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak at public comment?
Hi, I'm Rita Mitchell, and I just want to make a quick comment about the train station. And the last time we had an opportunity for public comment was in October of 2018. It's now April of 2019, a pretty long stretch before we've had an update. And the potential price of this project has nearly doubled from $87 million when we were told at that time. I think that's something that really needs a close look. And I really think that of the issues that I have with it, it's a question of the purpose and need as stated by the project. I really question whether the assessment of the existing station was done appropriately and with input from the community. I believe that the depot site is integrated with the city of Ann Arbor. It's stated in that report, the purpose and need, that it is not. That is a big issue for me. I think that when we have a station, it should serve our community specifically. And the opportunity to have a true dialogue on this issue is a big one. We really should also look at, are we getting transportation or are we getting car storage? And I think we're getting a lot of car storage. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi there, my name's Jim Schultz. Thank you very much for meeting tonight. Thank you, Ollie, for bringing up the comment about Tucson. I believe Danaher was responsible for that, and I think they should be responsible for dealing with the cleanup that we have here. Also, I'm concerned about people's basements and monitoring the dioxane in people's basements, and right now I find that it's up to the individual to pay for that. And I think Danaher should be responsible for paying for that. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is James Demore. In addition to other responsibilities I have with other affiliations, I became a member of CARD as well and have been being briefed up to speed in terms of this issue. With respect to the Superfund site, in response to previous speaker just now, all Superfund sites are not created equal. For the primary reason being is what specifically is the compound or the toxin that is being cleaned up. The difference between dioxane as opposed to other toxins that are designated Superfund sites, there are some that cannot have total cleanup. There's some that are going to be heritage for generations, perhaps de facto forever. Dioxane is not one of those toxins. Dioxanes can be treated. Dioxanes can be removed. We can achieve total cleanup. I believe the gentleman who spoke in terms of the proponents of Superfund speak to that as a greater vehicle to ensure for greater cleanup. I think the city should conclude that all options should be on the table, including Superfund. And remember that dioxane, as opposed to other toxins, you can achieve total cleanup, and with a responsible party in the case of Danaher. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak at public comment? Seeing no one, public comment is closed. May I have a motion to adjourn, please? Moved by Councilmember Malawi, second by Councilmember Smith. Discussion. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned.